Rain sweeps across the flat gray edge of Detroit past the last strip mall where pavement surrenders to gravel, a garage. Tin roof patched 3 times, a sign too faded to read. Inside, a man's hand rests flat on a running engine. Eyes closed, listening. 9 seconds, that's all he needs. Miles east, glass towers catch the stormlight. A charcoal pulse from an underground bay, tires hiss on wet concrete, a boardroom 14 floors up. Empty chairs around Walnut. A screen glowing with numbers nobody wants explained. Back on the county road, a pale blue Cadillac sits crooked on the shoulder. An old woman waves at traffic that doesn't slow. 6 cars pass her. The 7th stops, he opens the hood, rain running off his jaw, and what he finds underneath isn't age. It isn't rust, it's a clean, deliberate cut, made by someone who wanted this car to die in a very specific place. 9 seconds. That was all it ever took. The truck sat in the middle of the bay with its hood up and its engine running rough, and Richard Miller stood beside it with his eyes closed and one hand flat on the fender like a man taking a pulse. Gary Young watched from the doorway with his arms crossed and his patience running thin. He'd already been to 2 shops that week. Both of them had wanted the truck for 3 days. Both of them had used the word diagnostic like it was a religious ceremony that required deposits. Richard opened his eyes. High pressure pump. Not your injectors. Gary shifted his weight. The kid downtown said injectors. The kid downtown plugged a scanner in and read you what the screen told him. Richard wiped his hands on a rag that had stopped being any particular color sometime during the Obama. Injectors tick even. That's ticking offbeat. About an eighth late on the 4th one. You hear it? Gary listened. Gary heard an engine. No, that's all right. Most people don't. Richard leaned in and killed the ignition, and the bay went quiet in that sudden way that always made the building feel bigger than it was. 320. Parts and labor. Done before 3. Which was the moment Gary Young's face did the thing Richard had watched 1,000 faces do in this garage. The math face. The face of a man running numbers in his head that never came out the way he wanted them to. I got 200 on me. And here was the part where a smarter businessman would have said something else. Richard didn't. Pay the rest when you can. Gary looked at him a second too long, because nobody said that anymore, not in Detroit. Not in a shop that looked like this one, with a tin roof patched in 3 places and a sign out front so sun-bleached that you had to already know the name to read it. You don't even know me. I know your truck. Richard was already reaching for the socket set. Truck's honest, figure the guy driving it probably is too. So Gary put $200 on the workbench and left. And Richard got to work. And that was a Tuesday in April. And none of it mattered. Except it did later. It would matter more than anything. But he didn't know that yet. The garage sat at the ragged edge of the city past the last strip mall on Fenkel, right where the pavement gave up its ambitions and turned to gravel. There was a space heater in the corner that only fired on the 3rd try, and Richard had kicked its base 3 times before flipping the switch for so many winters that his foot did it now without permission from his brain. There was a folding chair by the workbench with a split in the vinyl. There was a coffee pot that had been burning the same coffee since roughly 2018, and there was a badge. It sat on the shelf behind a coffee can full of loose bolts, face down, gathering the particular gray felt that settles on things nobody touches. It had been face down for 11 years. Richard never moved it. He never mentioned it. If a customer's eye ever drifted that way, he'd hand them something to hold, a hose, a bracket, anything, and their eye would drift back. Some men keep trophies. He kept that. 46 years old. Divorced 6 years, which sounds worse than it was because the marriage had already been over for 2 before anybody filed paperwork. He got up at 5. He opened at 7. He ate standing up. He closed when the last car ran right, not when the clock said so, which was why the sign said 6 and the lights were usually on at 9. Downtown there were chain shops with glass waiting rooms and free espresso and technicians in matching polos with their first names stitched over the pocket. They had lifts that talked. They had software that printed a color-coded report. Richard had a rolling toolbox, a bad heater, and hands that understood an engine the way most people understand their own heartbeat. Guess which one paid rent? Emily came by on Thursday. 19 years old, first year at Macomb night classes, 4 shifts a week at a diner on 12 Mile where the tips were bad and the manager was worse. She had her mother's chin and her father's habit of standing in a doorway for a second before entering a room like she was checking the exits. She dropped her backpack on the folding chair. You eat today? I ate. What? Food. Name it. Richard didn't look up from the alternator he had spread across a towel in 17 pieces. There was a sandwich. There is always a sandwich, she said it flat. The sandwich is theoretical. The sandwich is a story you tell me. which made him smile into the alternator, and he was still smiling when she pulled the envelope out of her backpack and set it on the bench, and the smile stopped. Spring semester. He looked at it a long time, longer than he meant to. "I'm gonna pick up doubles," she offered. "Amber's got Saturdays open. It's fine, let me look at it." And there it was. 3 words. Them. The 3 words she had been collecting since she was 7 years old, the way other kids collect baseball cards. Except she was 19 now, which changed the shape of the thing entirely. Because a 14-year-old gets mad. A 14-year-old slams a door and makes you feel like a failure in a way that at least gives you something to push against. A 19-year-old just nods. Them. "Okay, Dad," and puts the envelope back in her bag and never mentions it again. Richard listened to her boots on the concrete going out. Them. And the door. Them. And her car turning over on the second crank, which meant the battery was going, which meant he'd need to get to that too. Them. And he stood there over an alternator in 17 pieces and thought. Them. She stopped asking. Them. He'd been waiting 11 years for her to stop being angry. Nobody warned him about what came after. The envelope showed up on Monday, not through the mail slot. Taped to the roll door right at eye level, where you couldn't miss it and couldn't pretend you had. Which is how you know before you open it. Them. Paul Moore had owned the parcel for 19 years and had been a reasonable man for 18 of them. But there was a commercial developer buying up the block. Them. And there was money in it. Them. Real money. Them. The kind that flattens a street and puts up something with more parking and less history, and reasonable men have a price like everybody else. Them. $8,400, 3 months back, 14 days. Richard read it twice, folded it along the creases it came with, which were somebody else's creases, some assistant's creases, and put it in his shirt pocket. Them. Then he went back to the alternator, because there was nothing useful you could do with anger except point it at a job that needed finishing. 2 clocks running now. He didn't know it, but they were both counting down to the same afternoon. The rain started at 4, thin at first, the kind that just makes the road shine. Them. Then heavier, then heavy enough that the wipers on his pickup stopped being wipers and became 2 smears rearranging the water, and Richard had to lean toward the wheel and squint to keep the yellow line where it belonged. Which is when he saw it, pale blue, parked crooked on the shoulder of the county road with its nose angled into the gravel like it had wanted to go further and hadn't been allowed. A Cadillac Fleetwood, 1996 if he had to guess, and he didn't have to guess. Them. There was a woman standing beside it in a raincoat that was losing badly. She had a phone in her hand that had clearly died some time ago, and she was waving at traffic with the specific half-raised arm of somebody who has already given up but hasn't figured out what to do instead. Richard counted the cars. He didn't decide to count them, he just did. 1, a minivan going too fast for the weather, spray fanning off the tires. 2, a silver sedan. 3, them. A landscaping truck with the trailer still hitched. 4 was a black coupe, low and glossy and expensive, and it slowed down. That was the part. It slowed down. Enough to look. Enough for the driver to turn his head and take in the old woman and the old car and the rain, to gather the whole picture, to understand it completely. And then it accelerated. Them. 5 and 6 went by without changing speed at all, which somehow bothered him less. Something turned over in Richard's stomach. The same thing that always turned over when he watched a person get treated like scenery. He pulled onto the shoulder ahead of her. Rain hit him like a thrown bucket the second he opened the door. He didn't run. Running made people nervous. Them. He walked up with his hands visible and stopped a respectful 8 feet out. "Ma'am, you need a hand?" She had a good face. That was the first thing. 76 if she was a day and still with the cheekbones, still standing with her shoulders squared like somebody had told her once at 16 that a lady doesn't slouch and she'd simply never questioned it. Them. Gray hair pinned up and now coming down in the wet. I would be tremendously grateful for one. She had to raise her voice over the rain, and she did it without shrieking, which was its own kind of skill. Margaret Wilson. "I apologize for the state of me." Richard Miller. "Don't apologize to the weather, it doesn't listen." Which got him a laugh, a real one. "It just quit?" It got sullen for a mile and then it quit. She patted the roof of the Cadillac with something close to affection. Them. "This car and I are about the same age and about equally stubborn. Neither of us takes advice. My grandmother had one of these, then you'll be gentle with it." She pulled her coat tighter. "My husband bought it in 96. He said it was the last Cadillac anybody built like they meant it. I don't argue with dead men, they always win." Them. Richard popped the hood, and the next 4 minutes rearranged his entire life, though he had no way of knowing it, standing there in the rain with water running off the end of his nose. Because the first thing he saw was a wire, a sensor signal wire running along the harness where it had run for 30 years, and it was cut. Not chafed, Not corroded through them. Not rubbed raw against a bracket over 3 decades of vibration, which is what happens to old wire, which is what he'd expected to find, which is what he'd found 100 times before. Cut. Flat. The copper strands sheared off in one plane like somebody had squared them up on a bench, in a spot where nothing rubbed, nothing moved, nothing had ever touched it. Richard's hand stopped moving. He kept his face exactly where it was. Because there was a 76-year-old woman standing 3 feet away in the rain, and there was no version of this where he got to react. He kept looking. Connector under the intake manifold had witness marks on it, bright ones, new. Not the dull rounded scuff of a part that gets pulled once a decade during a service, but the sharp parallel bite of something clamped on and yanked and shoved back into place by somebody moving fast. And then the fuse. He pulled it and turned it toward the light, and everything in his chest went cold and quiet. Wrong rating. Not wrong in the way a shade tree guy grabs the wrong one out of a coffee can either. Wrong in a specific direction. 20 amps sitting in a 15 amp slot, which to almost anybody on earth looks identical, which to a man who has spent 20 years inside wiring looks like a sentence with one word swapped, because a 15 would have popped. Clean. Instantly. You coast to a stop you call a tow. A 20 doesn't pop. A 20 sits there and lets the circuit cook. Slowly, over 15-20 minutes of driving the heat building where nobody's looking. And Richard's eyes went to the label on the fuse box to confirm what he already knew, and it said what he already knew it would say. Power steering. He did the math without wanting to. 70 miles an hour, wet asphalt. A 76-year-old woman with a 60-year-old habit of driving with 2 fingers on the wheel because a Cadillac from 1996 practically steers itself. And then it doesn't. And then the wheel goes to concrete in her hands on a curve. Richard set the fuse down on the fender very carefully, the way you set down something you don't trust. Ma'am, can I ask you something? She leaned into the shelter of the open door. You may ask me anything, you're the only person on this road with manners. You drive this route a lot? Never. Not once, actually. She said it easily, with no weight on it at all. My security fellow told me the 8 was backed up this afternoon. He suggested I come around this way. Richard nodded. He wrote it on the inside of his skull in permanent marker. And he said, makes sense, and reached for his toolbox. 20 minutes in the rain. He ran a new length of wire from his own spool and soldered it because a crimp in weather like this is a promise you can't keep. He seated the connector properly and locked the tab. He put the correct fuse in, and he put the wrong one in his shirt pocket, and he coiled the cut section of the original wire and put that in his pocket too, and he could not have explained why at the time. Yes, he could. He knew exactly why. He just didn't want to say it out loud yet, not even inside his own head, because saying it made it real. Somebody did this on purpose. While he was working, his knuckle caught something on the battery clamp. He looked. A scrap of decal. Half peeled. Blue and orange. The corner of a logo where somebody had picked at it and given up. It came away in his fingers. Familiar. Not familiar enough. Familiar the way a name is familiar when you can hear the shape of it but not the sound. He put it in his pocket with everything else and shut the hood. She turned the key and the Fleetwood caught on the first crank and ran smooth as a promise. And Margaret Wilson clapped her hands together once. Delighted. And the delight was so genuine that Richard had to look away for a second. She came around with an envelope. He knew what it was before it left her purse. He knew from the thickness. He knew from the way she was holding it, that particular apologetic angle people use when they're about to try to make something even. Absolutely not. Mr. Miller, ma'am, it's 20 minutes and 40 cents of solder. You stood in a monsoon. I've stood in worse for less. He gently closed her fingers back around the envelope with the flat of his hand, one motion, no argument in it, keep it. Put gas in the thing, and she stopped. She looked at him, really looked. The way people look at something they've suddenly realized they will need to remember accurately later. Cataloging the face. The height. The set of the jaw. You're not going to take it. No, ma'am. Why not? Which was a question nobody had asked him in a long time, and he answered it without thinking, the way you answer when there's nothing underneath but the true thing. Because you were standing out here for 20 minutes, and 6 cars went by. I counted them. One of them slowed all the way down to look at you and then left. He shrugged, water running off his shoulders. I'd rather not be the 7th person who took something from you today. Margaret Wilson didn't answer that. Not for a moment. Then quieter. In a voice that had a floor under it. What's the name of your shop? He dug a business card out of the glove box of his truck. It was 3 years old and the corner was curled and the ink had gone soft at the edges. and handing it to her in the rain. Watching it sit in her manicured hand was one of the more embarrassing things he'd done that year. There's one favor I'd ask. Name it. Don't let anybody touch this car who you don't personally know. He held her eye. Anybody, not a shop, not a service, not somebody who says they were sent. If it needs work, you find one man and you use only him. Something moved behind her expression. Not alarm exactly. Attention. Is there something you're not telling me? And he thought about it. He genuinely did. He stood there with the rain running down the back of his collar and considered saying it. Then he pictured her driving home alone in the dark with it in her head. There's a lot of old wire in a 30-year-old car, he said. I'd just rather it was somebody careful. She held his gaze one beat longer than was comfortable. She got in, and as she pulled the door, the dome light came up and Richard caught a glimpse of the back seat, where a leather portfolio sat squared against the upholstery, embossed with a corporate mark in gold, and the two words under it were legible even through the rain on the glass. Wilson Motors, which he noticed, and then folded up and put away, the way he had always folded up other people's business, because it was not his and because curiosity. Had never once put money in his pocket. He watched her taillights until they went around the bend. Then he stood on the shoulder of a county road in the rain for another 30 seconds, alone, with a cut wire and a wrong fuse and a piece of decal in his pocket, and the feeling in his stomach did not go away for the entire drive home. 9 o'clock. The garage. The sandwich sat on the workbench getting colder in the way that cold things get colder when they know you're not going to eat them. He didn't eat it. He went to the shelf, and past the coffee can, and past the badge he didn't touch, and pulled down a technical notebook with a cracked leather cover and 11 years of dust on the top edge. Sat down on the split folding chair, opened it. His own handwriting stared back at him from another life. Tighter than it was now, more confident. The writing of a man who still believed that if you documented something correctly, the documentation would protect you. He turned to a blank page and started drawing the fault from memory. The harness, the routing, each altered component in its actual position relative to everything else to scale because scale mattered. And it took him about 10 minutes to see it. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it, and he sat back in the chair so hard the vinyl split a little further. It wasn't the cut. The cut was nothing. Anybody with a razor blade can cut a wire. It was the order. Those three things, in those three positions, in that relationship to one another, produced a very specific outcome. A car that runs perfectly, runs beautifully, runs for 15 minutes, 20, 25, depending on load and speed and how hard you're working the wheel, and then goes, which meant the failure would not happen where the work was done, which meant it would happen somewhere else, somewhere unpredictable. Somewhere between here and there, chosen not by the person who did it but by the road. Richard put the pencil down. Vandalism cuts things so they die. Vandalism wants the damage now. This wanted distance. This was a timer, and a timer means somebody sat down, somebody thought about it. Somebody ran the numbers on how long a circuit takes to cook and where a woman would be when it did. He got up and walked the length of the bay and came back and sat down again. Then he took the scrap of decal out of his pocket and held it under the work lamp and turned it over and over between two fingers. Blue and orange, half a letter, the tail of still nothing. The phone rang at 11:40. The old wall unit with the actual bell in it, the one he'd never replaced because it was loud enough to hear over an air compressor, and in a silent garage at 11:40 at night it went off like a fire alarm, and Richard's whole body came off the chair. He picked up. The voice on the other end did not say hello. Mr. Miller, female, sharp. Every consonant filed to a point. The voice of somebody who has never once had to repeat herself and has built an entire life around that fact. Speaking, my name is Laura Wilson. In 4 hours, my security team will file a statement with the Detroit Police Department, alleging that you tampered with my mother's vehicle on the shoulder of a county road this afternoon. Richard's hand tightened on the receiver. I'm calling because I would like to hear your version first. You have 10 minutes. And here is what happened in his chest. Not fear of her, not exactly. He had heard this before, not these words, this temperature, this particular flatness that means a large thing has already begun moving, and is simply informing you of its trajectory. He'd heard it in a conference room in 2015 with a cold cup of coffee in front of him, and people walking past the glass wall with clipboards and carefully neutral faces. Nobody had raised their voice that day either. That was the thing about it. Nobody ever raises their voice. They just start the machine and let you watch it come. He sat down on the stool. Do you want me to argue with you, he asked, or do you want me to tell you what I found? A pause very short. The second one, so he told her. No embellishment, no adjectives. He gave it to her the way you'd give it to another engineer, because that was the only way he had ever known how to give anything. Sensor signal wire, driver's side of the harness, severed clean at a point with no chafe path and no adjacent contact. Cut plain consistent with a blade, not with abrasion. Connector beneath the intake showing fresh clamp witness marks. Parallel. Sharp-edged. Inconsistent with a hand pull. Fuse in the number 6 slot rated 20th in a 15 amp position. He got to the fuse and something on the other end of the line changed. He heard it. It was almost nothing. A shift in the ambient sound, like someone had stopped moving in a room. Say that again. The fuse was the wrong rating. No, which circuit? Power steering. And then there was a silence. And it was a very particular kind of silence. And Richard had heard enough of them in his life to know what this one was. It was the silence of a person hearing something that does not match the report they were already given. He let it sit. Then when it came back, her voice had lost its edge. And what had replaced it was worse. Mr. Miller, I need you to be extremely precise with me now. Are you telling me that fuse was in a circuit that would have failed while she was driving? That's what I'm telling you. Not immediately. No, ma'am. That's the part. He rubbed his eyes with his free hand. A 15 would have blown at the first surge. She'd have lost assist in the driveway and called somebody. A 20 sits there and takes the heat. She had 15, maybe 25 minutes of normal driving in her before that circuit gave up. She was on the county road. She was on a wet county road going 70 in a car that weighs 4,000 pounds and steers like a boat when the assist quits. He heard his own voice go quiet. You want me to say it politely or you want me to say it straight? The pause was longer this time. Straight. Whoever did this wasn't trying to kill your mother. He looked at the fuse sitting on his workbench under the lamp. But they weren't going to be particularly troubled if it happened. Nobody said anything for 4 full seconds. Then, and he would remember this for the rest of his life, he heard Laura Wilson exhale. One time. The way people do when they've been holding something. You didn't take money from her. No. She offered, she did. Why didn't you take it? Which was the second time that day somebody had asked him that. And he was too tired to make it sound like anything. Because I didn't earn it. It was 20 minutes, Mr. Miller. Something in the line went flat and formal again, but it was a different flat now, a working flat. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning I will be at your shop. Do not go anywhere. Do not discuss this with anyone. Do not throw anything away. I don't throw anything away, Axe wife. He hadn't meant to say it. It just came out. And there was a sound on the other end that might, possibly, in a certain light, have been the ghost of a laugh, before the line went dead. Richard sat in the dark garage with the receiver still in his hand and thought, well, there it is. Whatever it is, he didn't sleep much. They came at 9, not 8, and they came in 3 vehicles. A charcoal sedan with the low, silent, expensive sound that engines make when somebody has spent real money on not hearing them. Behind it, an SUV with 2 men in it who got out and stood in a way that was not standing. And a third car, smaller, from which a young woman emerged with a leather portfolio clutched to her chest like it might make a run for the tree line. Richard was elbow-deep in the fender of a pickup. He did not come out. Laura Wilson stepped onto the concrete of his bay, and the entire room reorganized itself around her. 38. Charcoal suit, tailored, the kind of tailoring you can see from across a room and can never quite point to. Dark hair pulled back hard. She was beautiful in the way that inconveniences people, the kind of face you remember before you remember the name attached to it, and she clearly knew it and clearly used it as a piece of equipment rather than a gift. She stood in the middle of an oil-stained floor under a lift that had been rebuilt twice and looked entirely like something delivered to the wrong address. The young attorney came in behind her. 31 immaculate. She reached the folding chair, stopped, took a tissue from her bag, and wiped the vinyl before setting her portfolio down on it. She did it without thinking about it. That was what made it land. Richard watched it happen out of the corner of his eye and felt something old and familiar settle onto his shoulders, like a coat he'd hung up years ago. He pulled his hands out of the truck, didn't wipe them. Coffee's terrible and there's one chair. Laura didn't smile. I don't need either. Suit yourself. She set a document on his workbench and turned it around with 2 fingers so it faced him. He didn't touch it. He read it upside down and then he read it right side up. And the number sat in the middle of the page in a font that had been chosen by somebody who understood what numbers look like when they're meant to end a conversation. $250,000. In exchange for a full release, a non-disclosure covering the condition, servicing, inspection, and mechanical history of the vehicle in question, and an agreement not to discuss the events of April the 9th with any party including media, law enforcement, or civil counsel, in perpetuity. Amy Walker held out a pen. The garage was very quiet. The compressor kicked on somewhere behind them and kicked off again. Richard read the whole thing once, start to finish. It took 90 seconds and nobody interrupted him. Then he set it down. He did not take the pen, Ms. Wilson. He leaned back against the bench and crossed his arms. If your mother's life was actually in danger yesterday, then silence is the very last thing on this earth anybody should be paying for. Amy Walker laughed. It was short and involuntary and she covered it immediately, but it had already happened and everybody had heard it. I'm sorry, she wasn't. Is a roadside mechanic about to lecture a Fortune 500 chief executive on crisis management, and this was the moment. This was where a younger Richard Miller, the one with a parking spot and a title on a door, would have gone red to the collar and said something clever and lost. He didn't go red. He reached under the workbench. He came up with two things and he laid them on the bench between himself and Laura Wilson, side by side, and he lined them up straight because that mattered to him. A 4-inch length of cut copper wire, and a fuse. That's the wire, he said. Come look at the end of it. Nobody moved. Come look at the end of it, or don't, but you drove out here for something. Laura Wilson crossed the bay and looked. You see how the strands are all in one plane, like they were cut on a bench. He picked up a second piece of wire from a scrap bin and held it beside the first. That's what chafe looks like. Strands go every direction, splayed. Some long, some short, some still hanging on. Rubbers worn shiny for 2 inches either side. He turned the first piece. No shine, no wear path. Nothing touching it for 3 inches in both directions. He set it down. That's a blade. Whoever held it was steady and wasn't in a hurry at that particular second. Amy Walker had stopped looking at her phone. Now the fuse. Richard picked it up between thumb and forefinger and turned it into the light. 20 amp. It was sitting in the 15 amp slot. And I want to be clear about something because this is the part that matters. He set it down harder than he needed to. That's not a mistake. A guy in a hurry grabs the wrong fuse out of a coffee can and it's a 5 or a 30 and the circuit either dies or melts something and you know immediately. 20 in a 15 is the one fuse on the whole board that looks right, fits right, and lets a circuit cook slow enough that nobody notices until the heat wins. He looked up. You have to know the board to pick that one. Laura Wilson's expression, which had been a very well-built wall, developed a crack in it and the connector. He tapped the bench. Fresh clamp marks, parallel, sharp-edged. That's not a hand and that's not a pair of pliers. That's a diagnostic breakout harness, which is a $200 tool that exists in dealerships and manufacturer service fleets and basically nowhere else. He wiped his hands on the rag. Finally. So here's what you've got. Somebody with a manufacturer-grade diagnostic tool, working unhurried in what I'd bet was a private lot, who knows fuse boards well enough to pick the exact one that fails slow. He shrugged. That's not a thief. Thieves take the radio. Amy Walker was completely still now, and the last thing. Richard held Laura's eye. This wasn't designed to make the car die. Anybody can make a car die. This was designed so that when the car dies and somebody writes it up, the report says one thing, which is age and neglect. He let that sit. 30-year-old vehicle. Original wiring. Owner in her 70s. Nobody looks twice. There's no report to file because there's nothing to report. That's the whole point of it. Somebody wasn't building a failure. Somebody was building a paperwork outcome. Nobody spoke. The compressor kicked on again, and it was the loudest thing in the building. And Laura Wilson said very quietly, "Say the last part again." Somebody engineered the story the inspection would tell. She turned away from the bench. She walked 4 steps toward the open bay door and stood there looking out at the gravel and the rain-wet street. And when she spoke again, she was not speaking to him at all. 47 times, Richard waited. She turned around. In 90 days I have read the word unresolved 47 times. Her voice had gone somewhere Amy Walker had clearly never heard it go, because Amy Walker's head came up fast. Prototype fleet. Closed test environment. 5 vehicles have gone down with sensor faults that self-clear before anybody can trap them. Every report comes back to my desk with a paragraph of language that says nothing, and at the bottom one word, unresolved. Ms. Wilson, Amy started. Not now. Laura didn't even look at her. Mr. Miller, we are 41 days from launching a fully autonomous vehicle line. Halo 1. It is the largest single commitment in the history of this company, and it is my father's name on the building. Richard didn't move. I employed 212 engineers. She came back to the bench. Not one of them has told me anything as specific as what you just told me, in 4 minutes standing next to a truck with your hands dirty. And there it was. The The thing he'd been dreading since the phone rang at 11:40. Because he could feel the shape of what came next. He could feel it the way you feel a storm coming in the joints of an old injury. I want you to come up to the technical campus. Today. No. It came out of him flat and immediate, and it surprised all three of them, including him. Amy Walker's mouth actually opened. Them. Laura Wilson tilted her head about 4 degrees. No, may I ask why? And Richard looked at her. At the suit. At the two men outside standing in the way that isn't standing. At the sedan. At the whole apparatus of a large and serious organization that had arrived at his door in 3 vehicles. Them. Because the last time I walked into a building like yours and said a true thing that nobody wanted to hear, it cost me 11 years. He said it without heat. That was what made it land. I didn't lose an argument. I lost a career, a house, them, a marriage, and my daughter's opinion of me, them. So you're going to have to give me a reason, and it can't be a check. Amy Walker looked at Laura. Laura looked at Richard for a long moment. Then she took out her phone. She dialed. She waited, them. And then she pressed the speaker icon and held the phone flat on her palm in the middle of a garage that smelled like brake cleaner and burnt. Coffee, Mother. Laura, darling, I was going to call you. I need you to tell Mr. Miller what you told me this morning. A pause on the line. Mr. Miller's there? He's standing right here. Them. And Margaret Wilson's voice came into the garage, warm and clear and slightly too close to the microphone, the way older people always are. And it did something to the room that no document on that bench could have done. Well, good morning. I'm afraid I've been thinking too much. Richard leaned toward the phone. Morning, ma'am. I've been up half the night going over it and I can't make it sit right. She sounded almost apologetic about it, which was somehow the worst part. You asked me yesterday whether I take that road often, and I said I don't, and I didn't think anything of it. But I've been turning it over. Nobody in the garage moved. Bill, he's been on my house detail 4 years now, lovely young man. Brings his little girl by at Christmas. Bill came out to the car before I left and mentioned that the 8 was backed up. Construction, he said. He suggested I take Ryder around and I said thank you, Bill, and I did. She stopped. And at the time it was just a kindness. Another stop. I want to be clear about that, because I keep trying to remember it wrong so it feels better. I never asked him about traffic. He came out to the car to tell me. The line hissed faintly. And I've been sitting here with my coffee thinking that a suggestion and a setup can look exactly the same from the inside, and you don't know which one you had until afterward. Richard closed his eyes for a second. Mother, Laura said. And her voice was doing something complicated. Did you check? About the 8, I did. Margaret Wilson's tone did not change at all. It was clear all day. Laura Wilson took the phone off speaker, said 3 or 4 quiet things into it and hung up. Then she put it face down on the bench next to the wire and the fuse. And she didn't say anything. And Amy Walker didn't say anything. And outside a truck went by on the wet road. And Richard Miller stood in his own garage and looked at the 3 objects lined up on his workbench. A wrong fuse, a phone. And next to them, still there from Monday morning, folded along somebody else's creases, the letter from Paul Moore. $8,400, 14 days. And in a backpack somewhere across town, an envelope for $1,240 that his daughter had stopped mentioning. Here is what went through his head in order, in about 2 seconds. Don't. You know how this goes. You have seen exactly how this goes. They come to you when they need you, and they are grateful, and they are warm, and they mean it. And then it gets expensive or it gets embarrassing, and then there is a meeting you are not in, and then you are the problem. Don't. Accept. Except a woman with good posture stood in the rain for 20 minutes and 6 cars went past her. Except somebody sat down at a desk somewhere and calculated how long a circuit takes to cook them. Except in 41 days there was going to be a fleet of cars with nobody's hands on the wheel at all. Except he had spent 11 years telling himself that the reason he never fought back was that he had no proof. And now there was a cut wire on his bench. Richard Miller picked up the rag and wiped his hands slowly, finger by finger, which took long enough that Amy Walker started to say something and stopped. Then he set the rag down. All right. Laura Wilson's chin came up. But not like this. He put one finger on the settlement document and slid it back across the bench toward her, out of the way, into the sawdust. I'm not taking that, And I'm not walking in there as your mother's mechanic doing you a favor, because that's a man with no standing, and a man with no standing is the first thing anybody throws off the sled. What do you want? $1. Amy Walker blinked. I'm sorry, a real consulting agreement. Scope of work. Defined deliverable. My name typed on it, dated. Countersigned. Filed wherever you file things. He looked at the young attorney directly for the first time since she'd wiped his chair. $1, I'll take the dollar. But my name goes on paper before I set foot in that building, and it stays on paper afterward. That's Amy Walker's brain visibly caught up with her mouth. That's not a normal request. No, ma'am, it isn't. Richard turned back to the truck he'd been working on and put his hands where they'd been an hour ago. Last time I went in the back door as a favor to somebody. And when it went bad, there was no record I'd ever been there at all, except the one they wrote. He looked over his shoulder. I'm not going in the back door again. Laura Wilson stood in his garage for another moment, and something in the set of her shoulders changed, minutely, in a way that Amy Walker could not have described and would not remember until much later. Draft it, she told her attorney, before we leave this lot. Then she looked back at the workbench one more time, at the wire, at the fuse, at the pencil sketch of a harness lying open in a cracked leather notebook, and out at a road where 6 cars had gone past her mother in the rain. Mr. Miller, ma'am, how long have you known that whoever did this works for me? Richard didn't turn around. Since about 4:15 yesterday afternoon, and what he would think about, much later, on nights when he couldn't sleep, was not the money, and not the boardroom, and not the thing that came after. It was that he stood there in his own bay with a socket in his hand and honestly, truly, genuinely believed he had just taken a side job. The agreement ran 14 pages. Amy Walker drafted it in the back seat of her car in a gravel lot with the engine running for the air conditioning, and she printed it on a portable unit that lived in her trunk for exactly this kind of morning. And she carried it into the bay at 11:40 with the pages still warm. She expected him to sign it. That was the thing. She fully expected a man in a work shirt to look at 14 pages of counsel-drafted language and sign it the way 99 people out of 100 sign things, which is to say at the bottom, fast, while apologizing for taking so long. Richard sat down on the split folding chair and started at page 1. Minute 4, Amy checked her phone. Minute 9, she checked it again. Minute 14, one of the security men leaned in the doorway and looked at Laura, and Laura shook her head 1 inch and he went back outside. Minute 21, Richard Miller took a pen out of his shirt pocket and crossed out a paragraph. Amy came off the wall. Section 9, subsection C, he didn't look up. Any work product, findings, methodology, or derivative analysis produced during the engagement becomes the exclusive property of the company, and the consultant waives all claim, including the right to independently assert or reproduce said findings in any forum. That's boilerplate. That's the boilerplate that means if I find something and you decide you don't want it found, I can't say it out loud. He wrote in the margin in block capitals, slow and square. Consultant retains right to independently retain and assert findings in any regulatory, legal, or safety proceeding. Initial there. Amy looked at Laura. Laura was watching Richard's hands, and section 11. He turned back a page. Company may terminate for cause including but not limited to conduct injurious to the reputation of the company. Also boilerplate. Also the exact language they used on me in 2015. He capped the pen. I signed one of these once without reading it. It cost me 11 years. Is how you end up standing in my shop yesterday morning, ma'am. So in a way it worked out for you. Amy Walker's mouth closed. Something happened behind her eyes. Not sympathy. Not yet recalculation. Cause is defined as adjudicated criminal conduct, she said finally. That's the only definition I'll accept. That's the only one I asked for. She initialed it. He signed. And Laura Wilson put a $1 bill on the workbench, flat, smoothed at the corner. And Richard picked it up and put it in the coffee can with the loose bolts. And none of them said anything about that at all. The Wilson Motors Technical Campus sat on 80 acres in Auburn Hills behind a gate that read your license plate before you reached it. Glass, landscaping with a maintenance schedule. A lobby with a ceiling 3 stories tall and a sculpture in it that had cost more than Richard's building. He parked his pickup between a Range Rover and a spot marked visitor, and walked to the main entrance with a toolbox in one hand, because he did not own a laptop bag and had decided at some point on the drive over that he was not going to pretend otherwise. The guard at the desk was maybe 25, polite, genuinely polite, which was somehow worse. Sir, deliveries and contractors is around the east side. There's a loading entrance with a check-in kiosk. I'm a consultant. Yes, sir. The kid's eyes went to the toolbox. Then the boots. Then back up. And he smiled. And it was not a cruel smile. It was a smile with an entire policy behind it. Anyone in work attire goes through the east entrance. It's a badging thing. It's just how the system's set up. Richard could have made a call. He had a number in his phone. He had a 14-page agreement in his truck with his name typed on it and initialed in 2 places. He looked at the kid, 25, making 16 an hour, following a rule written by somebody who had never once had to follow it. Yes, sir. It's a bit of a walk, I'm sorry. It was 400 yards. He walked it in the sun with a toolbox banging his knee, and he did not call anybody, and he did not mention it when he got inside. Not to Laura. Not to anyone. Then or ever. Which is a thing men his age do, and it is not always wisdom. Sometimes it's just habit. Laura Wilson did not introduce him as a consultant. She walked him into a lab with 9 people in it and said, "This is the man who worked on my mother's car," and Richard felt the sentence land on him like a dropped tarp. Because it was true. And because it was designed to be true and nothing else, 9 sets of eyes did the trip. Face, shirt, hands, boots especially. There is a thing that happens in a room full of people with master's degrees when a man in oil-stained work boots walks in, and it isn't hostility, it's something much more efficient than hostility. It's filing. "Can we get him the fleet fault logs?" Laura said. A young engineer named Marcus turned toward a monitor. "Sure. What's his network credential?" "He doesn't have one." "Okay, so I can pull them up on..." Marcus stopped. "Print them," Laura repeated, and Marcus exhaled, not loudly, just enough. Just enough that 4 other people heard it, and one of them looked at the floor. And Marcus went to the printer and stood there for a full 90 seconds, while a machine that hadn't been used in 6 weeks warmed up and coughed out 240 pages of raw diagnostic output. He carried them over in a stack. He set them down slightly harder than necessary. Richard didn't sit. He spread the first 60 pages across a table in 3 rows and put both hands on the edge and started reading. 20 seconds. 40. Somebody's phone buzzed and got silenced. At 90 seconds, Richard took a pencil out of his shirt pocket and circled 3 lines on 3 different sheets. These 3, Marcus came over with visible reluctance. "Those are environmental. Sensor drift." "How much drift?" 0.4%. "On all 3? "Yeah, exactly 0.4. Marcus opened his mouth. Richard tapped the pages. "Environmental noise is noise. It scatters. Temperature. Humidity. Road vibration. 0.6. 0.1. 0.9. It looks like weather because it is weather." He moved his pencil between the 3 circles. "This is then 0.4, then 0.4. Then it clears itself and goes back to 0 and the system writes it off." The room had gotten quieter in a way that nobody had decided to do. "That's not drift," Richard said. "That's a setting." Marcus looked at the pages for a long moment. "Print the other 5 vehicles," he said to nobody in particular. And then to Richard. And it cost him something. All of it. All of it, which is when the temperature in the room dropped, and it dropped because a door opened. Stephen Scott did not enter rooms. He arrived in them. 68. Silver, trim, wearing a suit that had been made for a body he'd had for 40 years and maintained specifically so the suits would keep working. He had co-founded this company in a garage in Warren, Michigan in 1979 with Anthony Wilson and a bad space heater and 11,000 borrowed dollars. And there was not a person on this campus who had not heard that story. He looked at the stack of printed pages first, then at the man standing over them. Laura, warm, genuinely warm sounding, which was the trick of it. "I've just come from Bill Hutchins in compliance, who tells me, and I told him he must be mistaken, that we've granted access to confidential prototype test data to a roadside mechanic." Nobody breathed. Now I know that can't be right. It was not a question. It had never been a question. It was a public correction wearing a nice suit, delivered in front of 9 engineers who would repeat it in 4 different conversations before lunch, and every person in that lab understood precisely what it was. Laura's voice stayed level. "He's under a signed consulting agreement and full NDA. Council drafted it this morning. Stephen let that hang. That's rather fast, isn't it? It's rather urgent. Everything is urgent 41 days out. That's what makes it 41 days out. He turned finally, to Richard, and he extended his hand, and his handshake was excellent. "Stephen Scott, I understand we owe you a thank you for Margaret." "No, sir. No? 20 minutes and a piece of wire." Richard let go of the hand. "You don't owe anybody for that. A rare position." Stephen smiled. "Most people would have found a way to be owed something. It's not a character flaw." The smile held, but something moved under it, briefly, the way a fish moves under ice. "Would you give us the room?" Stephen said. And it was addressed to Richard, and it was not phrased as a request even slightly. Richard gathered his pages. Marcus unexpectedly helped him square the stack, and he walked out. Which is when it happened. Because on the way down the corridor toward the east stairwell, with 240 pages under one arm and a toolbox in the other hand, Richard Miller passed a wall-mounted monitor outside a conference room that somebody had left on. He wasn't looking for it. He glanced. That's all. The glance you give a screen in a hallway, an error code sequence, 6 lines, scrolling, and Richard Miller stopped walking them. Not slowed, both feet, in the middle of a corridor, because that was not a familiar sequence. That was not a sequence that reminded him of something. That was a sequence he had personally documented in a 14-page internal report in March of 2015, a report he had written at a desk in a building 40 miles from here. A report that had gotten him escorted out of that building with a cardboard box 11 days later. Fault trips, secondary fault trips, self-clear, original fault reasserts. He knew the shape of it the way you know a face across a parking lot. He stood there for 3 seconds, then he made himself walk. Because if he stood there for 5, somebody would ask him why. He made it to the truck. He got in. He put the pages on the passenger seat and both hands on the wheel and sat in an 80-acre parking lot in Auburn Hills with his heart going like a man half his age. No, that's you're seeing what you want to see. 11 years of wanting it. That's what this is. Except, he hadn't wanted it. Not once. He'd spent 11 years specifically not wanting it. He'd put a badge face down on a shelf so he wouldn't have to look at it. Except a sequence like that doesn't happen twice by accident, because a sequence like that isn't a symptom. He didn't drive home. He sat in the lot until 7:40 and Laura Wilson found him there. Cab door open. Legs hanging out. Jacket off. Sleeves rolled. Watching the last of the light go off the glass on the west face of the building. She'd taken the suit jacket off too, first time. She leaned on the fender of a Range Rover in a $4,000 blouse without appearing to notice. You've been out here 5 hours. 240 pages. 480 now. Marcus emailed me the rest. Which was decent of him. And I don't have a computer, so I drove to a FedEx in Troy and paid $19 to print them. He held up a receipt. Expense that. You said you didn't want money. I said I didn't want $250,000. I'll take 19. He almost smiled. Man's got principles, not a fever. She didn't laugh. She said Meridian Diagnostic Systems. And Richard's face closed like a hand. You looked me up. I looked you up before I came to your shop yesterday morning. I'd be an idiot not to. She folded her arms. You lost a senior diagnostics position in 2015 over an unauthorized data access allegation. Company dissolved 18 months later. You've filed a Schedule C every year since. That's what's public. So tell me the rest. And he looked at her. And here is the thing about a story you have not told in 11 years. It calcifies. It becomes a shape you carry rather than a thing that happened. You know where all the pieces are, but you have not moved them in so long that you're not sure they still articulate. He almost said no. Then he thought about a monitor in a hallway. I found a back door. Laura went very still. The diagnostic software. Meridian licensed it to 4 manufacturers. It sat between the vehicle and the report car throws a fault. Software logs it. Log becomes the record. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the steering wheel. And in the right layer there was a function that let somebody with the right credential go back in afterward and reclassify a logged fault. After the fact. Change the category. Change the attribution. Meaning what? Meaning a car that failed because of a design defect could be recorded as a car that failed because the owner didn't maintain it. He said it evenly. Meaning a manufacturer eats a customer fault line item instead of a recall. Meaning if you did that 400 times across a model year, you'd save somebody about $80 million and nobody would ever know, because the only evidence a car ever leaves behind is the log. Laura Wilson said nothing at all. 14 pages. March 11th, he was looking at the building now, not at her. Sent it to my director and copied compliant. Because that's the process. Because they'd trained us on the process. Because I was 35 and I thought the process was a real thing that existed. And 3 days later the source data was gone, not altered. Gone, the whole capture set. And there was a new access log in its place. Timestamp March 14th, 2:11 a.m. Showing an unauthorized export from a workstation in my group. He finally looked at her. Signed with my digital credential. Were you there? I was asleep in Warren with a 3-year-old who had an ear infection. A short breath through the nose. I have a pharmacy receipt from 11:40 that night. I've had it in a folder for 11 years. Nobody has ever asked me for it. Laura Wilson's jaw moved once. They didn't fire me for 2 weeks, Richard went on. That's the part people don't understand. Nobody yelled them. Nobody accused me of anything to my face. They just stopped. He shrugged. Emails stopped getting answered. Then I wasn't on the invite list. Then my badge didn't open the third floor and IT said it was a glitch and I believed them for 4 days like a moron. Then on a Thursday 2 men I'd never seen before walked me to the lobby and gave me a box. That's it? That's it. There's no scene. There's never a scene. His voice did something then went somewhere flatter and further away. That's what they never tell you. You want an argument, you'd kill for an argument. An argument means somebody's saying something you can answer. He looked at his own hands. You can't answer silence. The parking lot lights came on all at once the way they do in banks. I applied to 61 places that year, he said. Every one of them called Meridian. And Meridian never said a single actionable thing about me. Not one. They'd confirm dates of employment and then there'd be a pause. And the pause did all the work, Richard. And you know what I actually think about? He wasn't performing now. That was the thing that made Laura Wilson's chest hurt. Watching a man not perform, it's not the job. I've made peace with the job. It's the night I realized my wife wasn't sure anymore. Laura didn't move, she never accused me. She defended me at her mother's house at Thanksgiving, loudly in front of everybody. But there was a night in August, maybe when I said something about how it would all come out eventually. And she said, sure it will. And then she went to bed. He stopped. You try living with somebody who isn't sure about you. It's not the anger that gets you. It's the being handled. The wind moved across 80 acres of parking lot. Emily was 8, he said. She's 19 now. She has spent 11 of her 19 years believing her father is a man things went badly for. He shut the truck door and rolled the window down and started the engine. That's the rest of it. Laura Wilson stayed in the lot after he pulled out. Then she drove to her office on the 14th floor and did not go home. And at 11:20 p.m. She told her assistant to pull everything that existed on Meridian Diagnostic Systems, and at 1:05 a.m. a box of PDFs landed in her inbox. She read until 2. The internal case file was 40 pages. It was not an investigation. She had read 1,100 investigations in her career and she knew what one looked like, and this was not one. It was a narrative. The access timestamp was 2:11 a.m. on March 14th. The building badge log, which somebody had helpfully included and apparently never read, showed Richard Miller's badge exiting the facility at 5:52 p.m. on March 13th and not re-entering until 7:31 a.m. on the 14th. Nobody had reconciled it. Nobody had even noted it. 3 signatures certified the finding, and all 3 of them reported to the same vice president. And then Laura Wilson scrolled to the appendix, to the org chart, to the 2015 leadership roster of a dissolved software company that had nothing whatsoever to do with her life. And she stopped scrolling. Meridian Diagnostic Systems, Senior Partner, Corporate and Regulatory, Timothy Clark. She read it 4 times. She got up. She walked to the window. She came back. She looked at it again in case it changed. Then she opened a second window and pulled the internal directory of her own company and typed 4 letters. And there he was. In a photograph taken at a leadership off-site in Traverse City 18 months ago, standing 2 people. Down from her with his hand on the back of a chair. Timothy Clark, General Counsel, Wilson Motors. 7 years. 7 years of board minutes. 7 years of privileged access to every technical document in the building. Every safety review. Every credential provisioning approval. Every single thing that crossed a desk with a legal hold on it. Laura Wilson set the glass down on her desk very carefully because her hand was not entirely steady. The man who knew better than anyone alive exactly how to rewrite what a machine remembers, sitting in her boardroom the whole time. Margaret Wilson called the garage at 9 the next morning, which was the 3rd time she had called in 4 days, and by now Richard had stopped being surprised by it. 2 things, and then I'll leave you to your work. Take your time, ma'am. First, Anthony put a camera in this car. Richard set down the wrench. In 2015, after the business with the Corbett boy down the street. It's mounted behind the mirror and I have never once looked at it, and I honestly forgot it existed until I was hunting for my sunglasses this morning and put my hand right on it. Ma'am, there's a second thing. She was enjoying herself slightly, which he found he liked. He also put the little device in the plug under the dashboard, for the insurance. They sent it out with a letter, and if you let them watch how you drive they take 15% off. And Anthony thought 15% was 15%. He stood up so fast the stool went over behind him. Mrs. Wilson, is it still plugged in? It's been plugged in for 11 years, dear. Nobody ever told me to take it out. Which is how Richard Miller came to be standing in a 14th floor conference room at 2 that afternoon, in clean jeans, with a whiteboard marker, explaining OBD2 to a chief executive officer and a general counsel's empty chair. That Fleetwood has no software worth the name. Laura's arms were folded. I know. No. You don't, and that's fine, and it's important. He drew a box on the whiteboard. It's a 1996, which matters because 1996 is the first model year the federal standard was mandatory in this country. Every car sold here from that year forward has the same 16-pin port under the dash. Same protocol family. Toyota, Ford. Cadillac. Doesn't matter. He drew a line. That car is dumb as a hammer. It has almost nothing to say. He tapped the box. But that port is a door, and a device plugged into that port has been sitting there for 11 years writing down every single time something else knocked on it. Laura's arms came uncrossed. It doesn't know what the visitor did, Richard said. It has no idea. It can't read intent. It can't read the work performed. It doesn't log the actual commands. But it timestamps the session, and it records the requesting device's identifier, and it records the interface protocol. He put the marker down. It's not a security camera, ma'am. It's a visitor log. Laura Wilson pulled the data herself from her own office with the door shut. The dashcam came first because it was easier. 8 days before the rain, 10:42 a.m. Private lot behind Margaret Wilson's building on Courchevel, which required a fob to enter. A man in a contractor's uniform walked into frame from the left. He was not hurrying. That was the thing that got Richard watching it on a laptop that afternoon with Laura standing behind his shoulder. He walked like a man who belonged there. He had a clipboard. He popped the hood, propped it, and worked underneath it for 7 minutes and 11 seconds, and twice he looked at something in his hand, and once he stopped and rubbed the back of his neck the way a man does at hour 6 of a shift. Then he closed the hood, wiped a smudge off the fender with his sleeve and walked out of frame. He never once looked over his shoulder. He doesn't know, Richard said. Laura leaned in. What? Look at him, look at his shoulders. He tracked back and played it again. A man doing sabotage checks the lot. That's not optional, that's biology. This guy checked nothing. He's working a ticket, so he's an idiot. So he's a subcontractor who got handed a work order. Richard paused the frame on the man's chest, and there it is, blue and orange. He dug in his shirt pocket and came out with a curl of decal he had been carrying for 4 days, and held it up next to the screen, and the tail of the letter matched, and the corner matched, and Richard Miller sat back in a 14th floor conference room chair and said one word quietly to himself, Halverson, because he knew that name. Because Halverson Field Services had done overflow calibration work for 3 of Meridian's manufacturer accounts in 2014 and 2015, and Richard had signed off on their paperwork himself twice, at a desk in a building 40 miles from here, in another life. Then they pulled the dongle log. It took 19 minutes because the insurance carrier's portal was a museum piece, and Margaret Wilson had to be walked through a password reset over the phone twice, and she was cheerful about it in a way that made everyone in the room want to protect her. The file came through as a CSV with 400,000 rows. Richard opened it and started at the bottom. 8 days before the rain, he scrolled to the date. 10:03 a.m. session initiated. Duration 4 minutes 12 seconds. Interface protocol J2534. Requesting device identifier tool WM839. The room went absolutely silent. Laura leaned Wilson Motors. That she stopped. She started again. Our tools are asset tagged. Every unit. It's an insurance requirement. They're $11,000 a piece. 40 minutes before the contractor showed up. Richard put his finger on the screen. 10:03. Somebody with a manufacturer-grade tool sat in your mother's parking lot and cleared her stored codes so the car came up clean. Then at 10:42, a Halverson tech shows up with a work order and does the physical. 2 people, and only one of them knows. He sat back. The one who knows didn't touch the car with his hands. He touched it with software 40 minutes early so the ticket the second guy got would look like routine maintenance. Laura Wilson put both hands flat on the conference table. This isn't a coincidence anymore, Richard said. This is a thread. Which is the exact moment, and he would remember the timing later with a kind of grim admiration, that Laura's phone lit up with an alert from her communications director. The Detroit Business Ledger ran it at 6:00 a.m. the next morning. CEO's private probe enlists engineer ousted in data theft case. There was a photograph, taken through the open bay door with a long lens, from the gravel across the road, and in it Richard Miller was leaning into an engine compartment with his back to the camera and a rag hanging out of his pocket, and the caption identified him as a man with a documented history of unauthorized data access, now advising a Fortune 500 chief executive on internal security matters. Every factual sentence in the article was true. That was the artistry of it. He had lost a job in 2015. There had been an allegation. The company had dissolved. He did operate a small independent repair business. He was, at present, advising the chief executive of Wilson Motors. Every sentence true, the whole thing a lie. By 8 there were 2 vans in the gravel. By 9:30 there were 3 of them. And a woman with a microphone was standing on his property, asking him through the open bay door whether he'd approached the Wilson family or they'd approached him. And Richard Miller stood behind a rolling toolbox in his own building and said nothing at all, which they filmed for 11 seconds and used. At 11:15 Paul Moore called. Not a letter this time. Richard, I'm gonna need you out. You gave me 14 days. That was before there were news trucks on my parcel. There's 4 days left on it, Paul. The developers people called me this morning. Paul Moore's voice had the particular strained apology of a man who has already decided and is now negotiating with himself, not with you. They asked me if there was litigation exposure on the site. Do you understand what that means for me? They used the word litigation. I'll have the 8400. By when? And Richard stood in his bay with a phone against his ear and a camera crew in his gravel and did not have an answer. Richard, I'm sorry, I am. But this is 19 years of my life, yeah, Richard said. He hung up. 2 regulars cancelled by noon. Neither of them said why. One of them said his brother-in-law had a lift now. And at 4:40 in the afternoon, Emily Miller's car pulled into the gravel, and she got out and walked past 3 news vans without looking at any of them, and came into the bay with a folded piece of paper in her hand. She did not say hello. She walked to the workbench and put the printed article down on it, flat in the exact spot where a cut wire and a wrong fuse had sat 4 days earlier. Then she pulled the folding chair around and sat down facing him. I'm not going to ask if you did it. Richard set down the socket. I know you didn't do it. Her voice was steady in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have. I've known that since I was 12. That's not the question. The question is why I've spent 11 years thinking my dad was a guy who got unlucky. The compressor kicked on. Neither of them heard it. You never told me. She wasn't crying. That was the thing. She was 19 and she had clearly rehearsed this in a car in a parking lot before coming in. You never once sat me down and said, this is what happened to me. This is what they did. You let me build the whole thing myself out of nothing. Out of you being tired all the time and us moving twice and Mom crying in the garage in 2017 when she thought I was asleep. Emily, I told people. In high school. Her jaw set. When people asked what my dad did, I said he fixes cars. And I said it in a way that she stopped. She had to. I said it in a way that made it smaller than it was because I didn't know it was ever bigger. Richard Miller sat down on the stool. And now there's a newspaper telling me my father was some kind of engineer who found something. And I had to find that out from a hit piece. The silence went on long enough to be its own event. You're right, he said. Emily's chin came up. She hadn't expected agreement. She'd come loaded for a fight. Then why? Because I didn't have proof. So? He turned his hands over and looked at them. A man without proof who keeps telling his story eventually stops sounding like a man who was wronged. He looked up at her. He starts sounding like a liar. And I could take being a failure in front of you. I could not take being a liar in front of you. Emily Miller's mouth opened and then closed, so I waited. 11 years. Which sounds noble, and it wasn't. It was just the only thing I could stand. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. And it turns out the price of that was you thinking one thing about me for 11 years. And I want you to know I've done that math, Em. I did it every year at your birthday. She sat there. Then small. And it broke him. Why didn't you at least tell me you were innocent? Because everybody says that. Which is when the tears came, both of them, quick and hard and over in about 40 seconds, because neither Miller had ever been able to sustain it. She wiped her face with her wrist. Sue them costs more than I have. Then say something. Go on the news. There's 3 of them out there right now, Dad. Just walk out and do what? He handed her a shop rag because there were no tissues in the building and never had been. When somebody calls you a thief, the louder you insist you're not one, the more people only hear the word thief. She looked at the rag in her hands. Then what do you do? And Richard Miller looked out the open bay door at 3 news vans parked on gravel he had 4 days left on. You do the work right, he said, for as long as it takes, until the silence starts speaking for you. Laura Wilson offered him the firm at 9 that night. 6 attorneys, defamation, retraction demand, and we go after the ledger's source. I'll have papers filed Monday. No, Richard, you bury them in your lawyers and that article becomes true. He was walking the length of the bay with the phone at his ear. Right now I'm an independent guy they smeared. 12 hours after your firm appears on a filing, I'm your guy. That's the whole play. That's what they want. 2 things, name them. Server data. raw, unfiltered, untouched, from before I ever set foot on your campus. Everything the prototype environment wrote for the last 180 days, including the stuff that got scrubbed. Done in 36 hours. Scott Hill did not want the call. 52. 8 years at the Federal Safety Administration before he went independent. And he had built his whole business on a single asset, which was that nobody could say who he worked for. Rich, I have 4 contracts. All 4 have a morals clause. I know. You're on the front page of a business paper with the word theft in the headline. I know, and you want me to put my name next to yours. I want you to put your name next to the data. Richard was sitting on the tailgate in the dark. If the data says I'm wrong, you say I'm wrong. In whatever room they put us in, out loud. There was a long silence on the line. You'd take that deal? That's the only deal I'll take. Scott Hill breathed out. What's the number? What number, fleet? Year 1. If this ships and it's real. Richard looked at the sky over Fenkel. 41,000 vehicles. The silence on the other end lasted 11 seconds. Send me everything, Scott Hill said. And Rich, I'm not on your side. I want that understood in writing. I'm on the side of what's in the file. That's all I ever wanted from anybody. The data came at 11:40, 310 gigabytes. And Richard's 9-year-old laptop lasted about 4 minutes before he gave up and started pulling salvaged control boards off a shelf. By 2 in the morning, he had built something that would have made an engineer at Wilson Motors laugh out loud, and that worked. Laura arrived at 12:50, alone, no security detail, no driver. She parked a car worth more than the building on the gravel outside and came in wearing jeans he did not know she owned. She had expected to find a man in over his head. What she found was a man in the exact center of his own competence, moving with no wasted motion at all, and she stood in the doorway for a full minute before he noticed her. There's coffee. It's an act of hostility. I'll have some. At 3:10 the space heater died. It went with a sound like a hinge giving up, and the temperature in the bay started falling immediately, and Richard didn't even look at it. Third try usually works. It's been 31 years. It got a good run. Laura Wilson wrapped herself in a mechanic's jacket that smelled overwhelmingly of engine grease and laughed out loud in a way that surprised both of them. This is not how I pictured this week. No? I had a media training session scheduled for Thursday. Someone was going to teach me how to stand. She pulled the jacket tighter. How to stand, Richard. He almost smiled. Then out of nothing. In the middle of the night. In a cold building. Do you know what they call me here? He kept typing, Anthony's daughter. Her voice didn't change at all, which was how he knew. 7 years as chief executive. 4.1 billion in revenue. 2 acquisitions. And in every room I walk into, somebody's first internal thought is Anthony's daughter. I'm the data theft guy. 11 years, he said. Every time somebody Googles me, every time a bank pulls a report. That somebody else picked it. Did you ever get past it? No, she waited. But I stopped answering to it, Richard said. Which isn't the same thing. It's just cheaper. Stephen Scott called it 2:40 a.m. Laura put it on speaker because her hands were full of paper and then regretted it and then didn't. You're awake. I am. I'll be direct because we've known each other since you were 9. Warm, still warm. That was the horror of the man. Stand this down tonight and it stays internal. Don't, and there's a special session called for Monday morning. And the votes exist, Laura. I've counted them twice. Stephen, 3 months of unexplained faults. Your own engineers can't close them out. And you have responded to that by handing raw prototype data to a man with a data theft finding in his file. A pause, perfectly weighted. I'm not the one gambling with people's lives here. I'm the one trying to stop a launch that isn't ready. Sit with that. And here is what Laura Wilson could not say out loud in a freezing garage at 2:40 in the morning. He was not entirely wrong. She sat down on an overturned bucket after the line went dead and put her face in her hands. And for about 90 seconds she was not a chief executive at all. She was a 38-year-old woman who had been handed a company by a dead man and had spent 7 years terrified of being the one who broke it. Richard Miller did not look up from the screen. He's right about the first half. Her head came up. He is. Your launch isn't ready and somebody should have said so out loud 6 months ago. He kept typing. He's just planning to make money off it, which is the part where he stops being right. And if I stand it down tonight, I keep the chair. You keep the chair and? Richard stopped typing. He turned around on the stool and looked at her, and this was not a mechanic looking at a client. It was one adult looking at another one at 3 in the morning with everything on the table. Keeping your seat while a defective vehicle goes out on public roads doesn't preserve what your father built. Laura Wilson didn't breathe. It just makes you the person who signed off on the next one. At 4:15 the reconstruction found the trigger. Not a fault. A schedule. A conditional routine sitting inside the fault simulation framework, dormant, waiting on a date value, and the date value was the 28th of May, the launch day. Richard sat with it for a full minute before he said anything, because he wanted to be sure, and then he was sure. It's not sabotage of the prototypes. Laura came around the bench. What? The prototype failures were rehearsal. He pointed at the screen. Somebody's been testing whether the mask holds. 5 vehicles, 90 days, 5 clean self-clears. That's a proof of concept. The actual event is scheduled for launch day. For launch day, in front of cameras with press in the vehicles, he looked up at her. Your stock craters inside an hour. The board has cause to remove you before the market closes. And whoever's been quietly building a position picks up the self-driving patent portfolio at a fraction of what it's worth, from a company nobody wants to touch. Laura Wilson stood very still in the cold. That's not sabotage, she said. That's an acquisition. At 5:12 a.m. the recovered credential chain resolved. Neither of them spoke. Tool WM839 was not assigned to engineering. It had never been assigned to engineering. It had been provisioned on March 14th to the Office of the General Counsel. The session that cleared Margaret Wilson's stored codes at 10:03 a.m. carried the authenticating credential of Timothy Clark, and the elevated privilege grant that authorized that credential to write to a closed test environment carried a secondary executive authorization stamp. Stephen Scott. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything for a long time. Outside the open bay door, the sky over Fenkel had gone the color of a dirty nickel, and a bird started up somewhere, and the coffee had been cold for 2 hours. That's it, Laura said. No, she turned. That's proof. Richard Miller pushed back from the bench and stood up, and every joint in him was 46 years old and had been awake for 22 hours. Now comes the hard part, which is making 20 people in a room believe a mechanic. Laura Wilson's phone buzzed against the workbench. She picked it up. Board secretary. Timestamped 5:12 a.m., which meant it had been drafted hours ago and released on a schedule. Special session 9:00 a.m. agenda. Removal of the chief executive officer. 3 hours and 48 minutes. That was the runway. Richard Miller drove home, stood under a shower until the water went cold, and put on the only thing he owned with a collar that buttoned. Gray. Bought in 2014 for a performance review he never got to have. It still fit. Which told you something about 11 years of skipping lunch. He looked at himself in the mirror over the sink for exactly 2 seconds. Then he went to the shelf. Past the coffee can, past the dollar bill folded in with the loose bolts, and he picked up the badge. First time in 11 years he turned it over. His own face at 35 stared back at him. Clean shaven, hopeful in a way that made his throat close. Meridian Diagnostic Systems printed across the top in a font that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. He put it in his jacket pocket. Not for luck, he didn't believe in luck, for weight. Then he picked up the toolbox, because he still didn't own a laptop bag, and he had decided somewhere around 4 in the morning that he was going to stop apologizing for that. 14th floor. Glass on 3 sides. 11 directors seated around a table cut from a single piece of walnut, and the temperature of that room when Richard Miller walked through the door with a scuffed red toolbox in his hand was not hostility. It was worse. It was the amused patience of people who already know how the morning ends. 2 of them smiled at each other. One didn't bother to hide it. He set the toolbox down against the wall, which made a sound, and the sound was the loudest thing that had happened in that room in 6 years. The security officer at the doors had already stepped forward. Sir, contractor entrance is...
He's counsel retained.
Amy Walker. She came out of the corridor at speed with a folder under her arm and her heels going like a metronome, and she did not slow down. Agreement number WM 244. Executed and countersigned. Technical consultant. Full site access. She stopped between Richard and the officer. He uses this door. The officer looked at her. He uses this door, she repeated. She did not explain herself. Not then, not later. Not to Richard, not to Laura, not to anyone. Some people change their mind out loud. Some people just start acting different and let you catch up. Stephen Scott opened at 9:01 exactly. He did it standing. He did it warmly. He did it with the easy authority of a man who had sat at the head of that table for longer than 4 of the directors had been alive. Before we take up the agenda, I want to say something that's difficult. Nobody moved. I've known Laura Wilson since she was 9 years old. I carried her on my shoulders at the Warren plant opening. Anthony was my closest friend for 31 years, and there is not a person at this day table who wants to be sitting here this morning less than I do. He let it breathe. But I have an obligation. And then he turned, unhurried, and looked directly at Richard Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing a $1.4 billion technology program. The individual our chief executive has brought into this building, into our closed test environment, into our unredacted prototype data has as his most recent professional distinction, a termination for unauthorized data access. He picked up a single sheet of paper. His most recently filed Schedule C reports gross annual income of $31,200. He set it down. I want to be very clear that I am not calling this man a bad man. A small, sad, terribly convincing shake of the head. I have no reason to believe he is. What I am saying is that he does not belong in this room, and that the judgment which put him in it is the judgment we are here to evaluate. Kenneth Lee, 71, at the far end of the table, pushed his glasses up onto his forehead. Nobody else moved at all, and Richard Miller stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not run his shoulders in that theatrical way men do. He just stood. He's right. Two directors looked up sharply. I make $31,000 a year. I was fired in 2015. My boots have oil on them, and I brought a toolbox in here because I don't own a laptop. He put his hands in his pockets. Every single thing Mr. Scott just said about me is accurate. I'd have said it harsher. The room had gone very still. So I'm going to ask for 10 minutes. He looked around the table, face by face. He did not rush it. And after 10 minutes, if you want me out of this building, you can throw me out any door you like. Front, back, loading dock. I've used 2 of the 3 already this week. Kenneth Lee's mouth twitched. But give me the 10 minutes first. Nobody said yes. Nobody said no either. Which in a room like that is the same as yes. He asked for 2 things on the main display. Raw diagnostic output from 3 prototype vehicles, and the session log from an insurance telematics dongle plugged into a 1996 Cadillac Fleetwood. The scoff went around the table like a dropped glass. Somebody actually laughed, a director named Boyd from the audit committee, and it was not a cruel laugh. It was the honest laugh of a man who thinks he has just watched somebody make a category error in public. The technical staff pulled it up, reluctant. 2 columns, side by side. 400,000 rows against 600,000 rows. Numbers streaming down a wall of glass and meaning nothing whatsoever to 9 of the 11 people watching. Kenneth Lee pulled his glasses back down. Son Richard turned. I've been in this business 51 years. The old man leaned forward. Forearms on the walnut, and his voice had no mockery in it at all, which was why the whole room listened. I ran a stamping plant in Flat Rock for 11 of them. Explain to me, and I'm asking straight, what a $3,000 Cadillac has to do with a $400 million prototype fleet. And this was it. This was the whole morning, sitting in one question from a 71-year-old man who wasn't trying to trap him. Richard Miller walked around to the end of the table and stood where Kenneth Lee could see him properly. Nothing, sir. The old man blinked. Not one bolt in common, not one wire, not one connector, not one line of code. They're 2 different species. He put his hand flat on the walnut, but they've got one man in common, and they've got one tool in common. He let that sit for a second. People don't reinvent a trick that's still working. Whoever did this had a method he trusted, and he was 41 days out from the biggest day of his life, and he was not about to try something new on the Cadillac, so he used the same tool, same account, same procedure. He straightened them. And every tool like that, every single one in every dealership in this country writes down where it's been. Because the manufacturer requires it, because the insurance requires it, because $11,000 equipment gets asset tagged. He looked around the room. I didn't catch this man with sophisticated software, sir. He tapped the table once. I caught him with a visitor log. Kenneth Lee sat back and he nodded once. Small, the air in the room turned over. Timothy Clark stood up, 59. Gray at the temples, half glasses, the practiced patience of a man who had spent 3 decades talking calmly past uncomfortable questions until the questions got tired and went home. Mr. Miller, this is compelling as narrative. It isn't evidence. He didn't even raise his voice. You've shown us 2 datasets and asserted a relationship. You haven't demonstrated one. And I'd remind the board that this gentleman has a documented history of asserting relationships in data that did not survive scrutiny. Beautiful. Genuinely beautiful. 11 years of Richard's life disposed of in a subordinate clause. Richard let him finish. Lets the silence run 3 full seconds after he finished, which is a thing you learn from watching people who are good at this. Mr. Clark? Mr. Miller, diagnostic tool asset number WM839. Nothing moved in Timothy Clark's face. Nothing at all, which was itself the answer. Provisioned March 14th of this year to the Office of the General Counsel. Richard reached into his jacket, took out a folded page and set it on the table without opening it. Not to engineering, not to the prototype program. To your office, a director halfway on the table said quietly, Why would legal have a J2534 interface? Nobody answered him. Would you like me to put the provisioning record on the screen, Richard said, or would you rather tell them yourself? Timothy Clark sat down. He did it smoothly. He did it like a man who had simply finished making his point, and every person in that room watched him do it. Stephen Scott moved immediately, because he was good, because he had been doing this since before most of them had driver's licenses. This has become a spectacle. He was already gathering his folder. Madam Secretary, I'd like to table the technical presentation and move directly to the agenda item. There's a motion on the floor and I'd like it voted. Second from somewhere. All in favor of proceeding to Article 9, Section C. Laura Wilson had not spoken in 11 minutes. She stood now. Founding Charter of Wilson Motors, executed March 2nd, 1979 Warren, Michigan, never amended, never repealed, restated in full in the 1994 bylaws revision at pages 208 through 211. Stephen Scott stopped moving. Where credible evidence establishes that the chairman of the board has endangered a member of the founding family, or has knowingly compromised the safety of a product bearing the company name, the sitting chief executive may trigger an emergency independent audit and suspend the chairman's voting authority with immediate effect. She looked down the table at him. My father wrote that in 1979, the year you shook his hand. Something happened to Stephen Scott's face. Not fear, older than fear. The specific expression of a man being shown a thing he had spent 47 years hoping had been forgotten. Timothy Clark was on his feet again in half a second. That provision is void. It is not. It contains a condition precedent. He was fast now, faster than he'd been all morning, and everybody heard the change in gear. Subsection 2. Suspension of the chairman requires certification by a living founding shareholder. There are no living founding shareholders. Anthony Wilson died in 2019. The provision is a dead letter and has been for 7 years. Laura opened her mouth. Timothy Clark kept going, because he could feel it. He could feel the room tipping and he was going to nail it down. With respect, this board cannot act on a clause that has no mechanism. Madam Secretary, I'd ask that the motion to proceed be the doors opened. Everyone at that table turned, because that is what human beings do. And afterward, every single one of them would remember it differently, and all of them would remember it. 76 years old, navy blue, back straight as a plumb line. Her hair pinned properly, and her chin at the exact angle that a woman is taught at 16 and does not surrender at 76. And she crossed 40 feet of carpet without hurrying and without so much as glancing at the man she had come for. She set a folder on the table. Founding share certificate. Original issue. 1979. Trust documentation transferring survivorship interest to Margaret A. Wilson upon the death of Anthony J. Wilson, executed 2019, notarized, and a certification signed that morning at 7:40 a.m. In a kitchen on Courchevel invoking Article 9, Section C. Timothy Clark looked at the documents. Then he sat down, and this time it did not look smooth at all. Hello, Stephen. Stephen Scott did not answer. I'd like to say something to the board if I may, and then I'll get out of everyone's way. Nobody objected. Margaret Wilson put one hand on the back of an empty chair. On the 9th of April, I was standing on the shoulder of a county road in the rain for 22 minutes. I counted. I had nothing else to do. She looked around the table. 6 cars went by me. She let that number sit there. One of them slowed down, all the way down. Long enough for the driver to see an old woman in a bad coat next to a broken car and understand the entire situation completely. Her voice did not rise at all, and then he drove away. Somebody at the table shifted. The 7th vehicle stopped. The man who got out of it did not know my name. He did not know whose mother I was. He did not know there was a nickel in it for him, and when I tried to put money in his hand, he closed my fingers around it and told me to buy gasoline. She turned her head. And you have spent this morning debating whether he is fit to stand in this room. She picked up her handbag. I've spent it wondering about the rest of you. Nobody in that room said a word. The simulation ran at 9:52. Richard didn't explain the architecture because 9 of the 11 wouldn't follow it, and the 2 who would were already leaning forward. He said this instead: I'm going to make the code do the thing it was built to do, in front of you, and I'm going to let it get caught doing it. He fed the reconstructed conditions from the Fleetwood, the exact fault sequence, the exact timings, the exact clearing pattern into the rebuilt prototype environment. And on a wall of glass in front of 11 directors, a routine woke up. It threw a fault, it threw a secondary. And then in real time, at machine speed, while people watched, It reached back into its own log and began erasing the record of what it had just done. Two directors stood up out of their chairs without seeming to know they had. There, Richard said. He froze the frame. See that? 11 milliseconds. It scrubbed the primary and the secondary, and it started on the timestamp index, and it ran out of time. He pointed. That's the right handle it couldn't close. Under normal operation. Nobody's watching. It's got all day. It cleans up perfect. Under load in real time, with a second process reading the same table, it leaves a thumbprint. He turned around. Machines can lie, ladies and gentlemen. They're very good at it. But they lie the same way every single time, and they can't stop themselves from writing down that they did it. Scott Hill spoke for the first time. He had been sitting at the end of the table since 9:0 with a legal pad in front of him and had not made a sound. I want 3 things on the record. The board secretary looked at Laura. Laura nodded. 1. My name is Scott Hill. I am not employed by retained by or compensated by Wilson Motors, and I am not compensated by Richard Miller. I'm here because he asked me to look at a file and tell the truth about it in whatever room it ended up in, including if the truth hurt him. He turned the legal pad over. 2. The dataset I examined carries server-side write timestamps beginning 180 days ago. Mr. Miller's consulting agreement was executed 9 days ago. He first entered this campus 8 days ago. The material predates his access by a factor of 20. Fabrication by this individual is not unlikely. It is technically impossible, and I'll put that in a signed declaration this afternoon. Somebody let out a breath. 3. Scott Hill looked directly at the 2 directors who had smiled at each other an hour earlier. This is not on my pad, this is mine. A man with a finding like Mr. Miller's in his file can go into private consulting and do quite well. No public record, no name on anything, invoices through an LLC, 6 figures, comfortable, permanent. I know 4 men who did exactly that. He chose instead to take a name that was already broken and bet it again in public on a job that pays him $1. He capped his pen. Doubt his motives if you want, but doubt them in the right direction. Laura Wilson put the rest of it up. The dashcam footage. Time-stamped. From a private lot with fob entry. A Halverson technician working 7 minutes and 11 seconds under a hood that was not his business. The tool provisioning record. Office of the General Counsel. March 14th. The authenticating session credential at 10:03 a.m., 8 days before the rain, Timothy Clark. And the elevated privilege grant that let that credential write to a closed environment, carrying an executive authorization stamp that existed in exactly one place in that company. Stephen Scott. The tribunal Stephen Scott had convened to end Laura Wilson's career had, in the space of 58 minutes, turned itself completely around. And the man on trial in that room was now the man who had built it. Kenneth Lee moved for immediate suspension of the chairman's voting authority under Article 9, Section C. It carried 9-0, with 2 abstentions and 1 member's authority suspended. The corridor outside had gray carpet and windows on one side and nobody in it at 10:40 in the morning, except 2 people who had known each other for 47 years. Margaret Wilson waited for him. Stephen Scott came out alone. No folder, he'd left it on the table. Doug. Nobody had called him that since 1994. He stopped. Do you remember the space heater? He didn't answer. In Warren. That garage on Grosbeck with the roll door that stuck. She was not angry. That was the thing that took his legs out from under him. She was not angry at all. The heater only fired if you kicked the base of it. Anthony kicked it. You wouldn't. You said a man shouldn't have to assault his own equipment. Stephen Scott looked at the carpet. March of 79. $11,000 and a bad heater, and the 3 of us in that garage until 2 in the morning, and there was 1 sandwich, and you cut it in half with a utility knife, because we didn't have a proper one. She adjusted the strap of her handbag. You gave Anthony the bigger half. His jaw moved. You did. I watched you do it. I've thought about it more times in my life than you'd believe, Doug, because that was the day I stopped worrying about whether my husband had picked the right partner. She looked at him then, fully. And I want you to understand that I am not standing here disappointed in what you did 4 weeks ago. Stephen Scott's eyes came up. I'm standing here trying to work out which year you became somebody who could do it. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. I'm sorry for you, Margaret Wilson said. And she walked away down a gray corridor, and Stephen Scott stood alone outside a boardroom on the 14th floor of a company he had built with his own hands, and there was nobody left to explain himself to. The rest came apart fast, the way these things do once the first joint gives. The scheme, laid end to end by 3 forensic firms over the following 11 weeks, had been architected for 18 months. A conditional safety failure buried in the fault simulation framework, timed to detonate publicly on the 28th of May with press in the passenger seats. Stock collapse inside a trading session, cause for removal of the chief executive by close of business. And a group of allied investors, 4 entities, 3 of them domiciled in Delaware. One a family office in Chicago that had been quietly building a position since November, acquiring the autonomous patent portfolio out of a wounded company at approximately 11 cents on the dollar. And Margaret Wilson's Cadillac had never been the target. That was the part that took the wind out of Laura Wilson 3 weeks later, reading the summary. It had been a low-risk rehearsal, a live fire test of whether the paperwork mask held under a real inspection. And a second purpose, which was simpler and uglier. Margaret Wilson held founding shares. There was a shareholder meeting on the 22nd of April. Her vote, if cast, tipped a block decisively toward her daughter. A frightened 76-year-old woman who'd had a bad experience on a wet county road might reasonably decide to stay home. That was it. That was the whole reason. Nobody involved in 18 months of planning had ever once considered the possibility that a broke mechanic would stop on the shoulder for free, look under the hood and refuse to leave it alone. Timothy Clark tried the contractor. He tried it for about 6 days. Halverson Field Services was a rogue subcontractor. Halverson had been given a maintenance ticket and had exceeded scope. He was personally appalled. Except Laura Wilson's recovery team had the wire transfers, 4 of them, structured through a professional services LLC registered in Wilmington, and the third one had been initiated from a workstation in the office of the General Counsel at 4:12 on a Tuesday afternoon. And they had the emails, which were worse than the money, because the emails contained a sentence Timothy Clark had typed himself on a Thursday in February about acceptable exposure on the Kercheval item. He was suspended before he finished clearing his desk. 2 men he had never met walked him to the lobby and gave him a box. Richard Miller did not celebrate any of it. He did not go to the press conference. He did not sit for the interviews. He did not accept a call from a national business network that offered a car and a hotel. What he did for 48 straight hours was go through the manifest. 12 prototype vehicles carried the compromised build, not 5. 12 because the framework had propagated during a routine over-the-air push in February, and nobody had caught it, because nobody had been looking for something that was designed to be invisible. He personally verified the pull on every single one. He was in the proving ground at Milford at 11 at night with a flashlight and a printout, checking VINs off a list by hand, because a database can be wrong and a man's eyes are harder to fool. The last one came off the pad at 2:20 in the morning. He signed the log, gave the pen back to a security supervisor named Ray, who had been standing out there with him for 4 hours without complaining once, and drove home. That was the whole ceremony. Because he had not fought this for money, and he had not fought it to get even. He had fought it because he knew in his own body precisely what a manufactured lie can do to a real thing. And he was not going to let another one take somebody's life. Laura Wilson offered him the job on a Thursday. Director of Independent Diagnostic Safety. New position, reporting to the chief executive, with veto authority over any technical report touching vehicle safety, a veto that could be overridden only by unanimous vote of the full board. The salary would have cleared his debts by August and bought the parcel on Fenkel outright by Christmas. He sat with it for a long time. That world ground me up once, Miss Wilson. I know. It didn't apologize, it didn't even notice, it just kept going. He turned the offer letter over on the workbench without reading the second page. You're asking me to walk back in and trust that this time the floor holds. I'm not asking you to trust the floor. He looked up. I'm telling you my company cannot sleep at night without you. Laura Wilson didn't blink. That's not a favor to you, Richard. That's a confession about us. He didn't answer. Not that day. Margaret Wilson solved it 8 days later the way she solved most things, which is to say by simply arriving with the answer under her arm. She came up the gravel in the Fleetwood at 4 in the afternoon with a wooden sign wrapped in a moving blanket in the back seat. She made him carry it in himself. She made him unwrap it on the bench. Miller Diagnostic Independent Safety Partner Wilson Motors hand-painted them. Not printed. She'd found a man in Ferndale who still did it with a brush and a maul stick and had charged her $240 and had thrown in the second coat. Richard Miller stood over it for a while and didn't say anything. Well, Margaret said, say something, I'm 76. It's the answer to the question neither of you had the sense to ask out loud, because that was exactly what it was. Instead of absorbing him into a structure that would have sanded down every sharp and honest thing about him inside of a year, Wilson Motors signed a formal partnership agreement making a shop on Fenkel unofficial. Independent inspection site. 18 months prepaid. $140,000 against a schedule of work. He kept the garage. He kept his name on the door. He kept the right to say no. And people who had once looked at his building and kept driving started sending him their most expensive vehicles. He drove to Paul Moore's house on a Saturday with a check. Paul came out onto the porch in a Lions sweatshirt and didn't know what to do with his hands. "Richard, listen. With the news trucks, I want to say, I was Paul." Richard held out the envelope. "You did your job and I did mine. 19 years is 19 years. Take the money and sign the deed." Paul Moore took it. He looked at the number and had to sit down on his own steps. "You bought it. I bought it. The developer can build around me." Richard was already walking back to the truck. "Sign it Monday. Bring your wife. I'll buy lunch." He wrote the second check at his own kitchen table, and it took him longer than the first one. $1,240. He clipped it to the tuition statement, which he had gone into Emily's old backpack to find, because she had never mentioned it again, not once, not in 5 weeks. He left it on the table where she'd see it. He didn't say anything about it. He went out to the garage and started on a water pump. She found it at 7. He heard the screen door and then nothing for about 90 seconds, and then boots on the concrete. Emily Miller stood in the bay doorway holding a check. "You said your silence would speak for you." Richard didn't look up from the pump. "Did it finish?" He set the wrench down on the fender. "It finished, kid?" She crossed the floor and put her arms around him, and he was covered in coolant to the elbow, and she did it anyway, and neither of them said anything. For a while, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. Halo 1 launched 5 months late, on the 4th of November. Every unit shipped with a revised LiDAR calibration, a hardened diagnostic right layer that no credential on Earth could reach retroactively, and an independent inspection certificate. Laura Wilson did the interviews herself, and she did something in them that surprised the people who had written her off as a chief executive protecting her flank, which is that she named him. Every time. She talked about a mechanic on the West Side, who had seen the truth clearly while an entire boardroom was looking at margin. And she never once let an interviewer shrink him down into a heartwarming footnote in a corporate turnaround story. And when one of them tried a man from a business network, who used the phrase unlikely hero twice, she stopped him. "He's not unlikely, he's the most likely person in this story. He was the only one in the building whose job was to figure out what's actually wrong with something." Richard hated all of it. He watched exactly one of the interviews, on a laptop in the bay, with his arms folded, and turned it off before the end and went back to work. 2 things hung on the wall of the garage now. The first was a letter, not a press release, not a statement of regret drafted by communications and lawyered into meaninglessness. A 1-page letter on Wilson Motors stationery formally correcting the record on the 2015 Meridian Diagnostic Systems finding, entered into 3 industry databases, signed by the chief executive, countersigned by Scott Hill as independent auditor. Beneath it, framed in the same black wood, his independent safety partner certification. He never mentioned them to customers. But he'd noticed that men his own age would stand in front of that wall a little longer than the small talk required, reading, and then not say anything about it, and then talk about their brakes. Margaret Wilson kept driving out. Not because anything was ever wrong with the Fleetwood. Richard had gone through it, end to end in June, and it was in better health than either of them. But because she'd bring 2 coffees from a place on Woodward, and sit in the folding chair with the split in the vinyl, and hold her cup with both hands, because her hands got cold now. She called him son, he called her Mrs. Wilson. He tried Margaret once in July, and it came out wrong, and they both let it go. Laura came out too some Saturdays. Different posture entirely. She'd stopped carrying suspicion in her shoulders sometime around the 2nd week of May and had never picked it back up. She still gave him grief about the space heater. He'd bought a new one, good one. $200, fired on the first switch every time, and it lived where the old one had lived. The old one stood in the corner by the parts washer with its cord wrapped around it. He never threw it out, never explained it either, and Emily had stopped asking, and Margaret Wilson had figured it out on her own the first time she saw it, and had said nothing at all, which is why he liked her. Word travels slow in a place like that, and then all at once, old customers started coming back. Men who had taken their business to the chain shops downtown 2-3 years ago because his building looked too tired and too small, and there was something faintly embarrassing about pulling into that gravel. Nobody explained themselves. One of them, Gary Young, Showed up in October with a check for $120 folded in his shirt pocket, 4 months late, and put it on the workbench without a word, and Richard put it in the drawer without a word, That was the whole transaction. He never brought up the boardroom. Never said Stephen Scott's name out loud if he could root around it, which he mostly could. And not once, not one single time did any of it change how he greeted a man who came through that door with a knocking engine and an empty wallet. He still fixed cars for people who couldn't pay that week. More of them now, actually, because he could afford to. Some habits get built out of necessity and then quietly outlive the necessity and turn into the person you are. The trial dates got set for spring. Richard would testify he knew that. He'd already sat with 2 federal attorneys for 11 hours across 3 sessions. And they'd told him he was the best prepared witness they'd worked with in 9 years. And he'd said, "That's because I write things down." And one of them had laughed and the other one hadn't, because she understood. He did not think about it more than he had to. He drove Emily back from her summer program the first weekend of August, up 75 with the windows down because the truck's air conditioning had been theoretical since 2019. She was quiet for about 40 miles. Then there's a thing. On my team, the data team. She was picking at the door seal. The numbers on our run didn't come out, and Kayla just adjusted them. 2 points. Nothing huge, and everybody saw her do it and nobody said anything, and now we're all 4 days from submission. Richard kept his eyes on the road. "You want me to tell you what to do?" "I want you to tell me what happens if I do it." Which was the smarter question, and she'd known it was the smarter question, and that was his kid. He drove another mile. "You'll be right," he said, "and you'll be alone. And being right will feel like nothing at all for a while because it doesn't come with anything. There's no ceremony. There's just a room that goes quiet when you walk into it." "Great, thanks. Let me finish." She waited. Sometimes doing the right thing takes nearly everything you've got, and it takes it for a long time. He changed lanes. And then if you're patient and a little bit stubborn, it gives some of it back, with interest. Emily Miller looked out the window at Michigan going by. Some of it. Not all. He didn't dress it up. He'd never dressed anything up for her, and he wasn't going to start on the interstate. "You don't get the 11 years back, kid. Nobody gets the years back. Then what's the interest?" And Richard Miller, 46 years old. 2 hands on the wheel of a truck he'd rebuilt twice. Thought about a wooden sign hand-painted by a man in Ferndale, and a letter in a black frame, and a girl who'd stopped asking him for things and had started asking him for something better. "The part it gives back," he said, "is the part you were never going to be able to buy." She didn't fully understand it that night, but she filed it away. The way children do with the things their parents say quietly and mean completely. And she'd take it out 11 years later at a conference table in Grand Rapids with her own career on the line, and it would hold. She reported it on the Tuesday. She lost 2 friends over it. She never told him the last thing. There was a rain in late October, hard and cold and early, and Richard Miller was driving home on the county road because he still took that road, and he passed a woman standing on the shoulder next to a Corolla with the hood up, maybe 30, phone in her hand. He counted the cars ahead of him without deciding to. 2. Both went past. He pulled onto the shoulder ahead of her and got out into the weather and walked up with his hands where she could see them and stopped a respectful 8 feet out. "Ma'am, you need a hand?" It was the alternator. It always is. He had her running in 19 minutes and she tried to pay him and he closed her fingers around the money the same way he'd done it in April. And she asked for the name of his shop and he gave her a card. And this one had square corners because Emily had ordered 500 of them in June. Then he drove home. There was no phone call this time. There was no chief executive, no boardroom, no 11 years of a man's name coming back to him out of the dark. There was just a wet road and a shop that was his now, free and clear, with 2 things framed on the wall and a broken space heater standing in a corner like a monument nobody had asked for. And that was the point. Because on a gray afternoon in April, Richard Miller had believed he was doing nothing more than fixing a stranger's car out of ordinary decency. He had no idea that one small act of kindness would turn out to be the wrench that finally cracked open a much larger machine one built quietly out of greed, and forged signatures and years of power that nobody had ever bothered to check. Or that when he was done taking that machine apart, it would hand him back the one thing that money had never once been able to buy him: his name.